On today's episode, we try to break down the stigma of mental health. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to For These Are My Thoughts. I'm your host, Blake. Today, we are going to be talking about mental health. So this episode is a little bit longer than the previous episodes and definitely a little bit deeper, but I think that is so worth it. Today, I am joined by Reverend Dr. John Oberdeck, and today we're going to be chatting about mental health and our experiences with it. So again, I'm joined today by Reverend Dr. John Oberdeck, Dr. O, as I call him. Dr. O, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to join you on this podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. You're like the first big name person I could think of, and I really do respect you a lot, which we'll get into in a little bit. But Dr. O, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the people listening?
All right. I served as a pastor for 10 years in the Southern Illinois district, first at a dual parish and then later at a larger congregation where I had the chance to also supervise field education students and 3 vicars. And then I got a call to Concordia Seminary where I taught for 13 years on the practical department theology faculty there at St. Louis, and then retired after having taught 15 years at Concordia University, Wisconsin, where I was the director of the lay ministry program for a time and taught the youth ministry courses along with several other electives and other courses that they have there. Married, have 3 children, 7 grandkids, and now I'm pretty much retired, although I do teach an occasional online course for Concordia, Wisconsin. I'm involved with their alumni council. I'm also very involved with my congregation, which is an inner city congregation in Milwaukee, Mount Calvary Lutheran Church. I'm on several of the committees there, the youth committee, the outreach committee, and it's interesting to watch what urban ministry is like, given that my own parish ministry as a pastor was rural Southern Illinois. So, there are some things that are very similar and other things that are really, really significantly different.
So yeah, Dr. O and I, that's kind of where we met, was in college. You were my advisor in college, and you also taught a great deal of the classes I took, because I took the practical, I guess, classes more so than the heady knowledge ones, whatever exegetical word you would use there. But yeah, so do you remember when you first met me and what your first impression of me was?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think back and see what that was like. Frankly, no, I don't recall exactly the first time that we would have met, whether it was in my office. I don't think that you arrived on campus for a campus visit.
No, yeah, I never visited school, and I actually was a physical education major at first. And so the first time we ever met, I think it was in your office, and I was debating, I was going to switch my program, and I was debating between pre-seminary or pre-pastor and the lay ministry program, and that's where you convinced me.
Okay. Yeah. Many times the first time I'm introduced to students is when they come with their parents for a campus visit, and they're looking around and just checking out the program and seeing what it's like. And I didn't have any memories of that taking place or meeting any of your family at that point. So I'm thinking it must have been in some other context. My impression is that point is that you were searching. You were searching for a direction. You weren't quite sure what it was that you wanted to do, or where you felt God might find a use for you in your life with the talents and gifts that you have. And so that's really what I think you came in to explore, was what should you do next? Obviously, you felt drawn towards some aspect of ministry, now, what did you say you came as? Athletic director? Or what?
Physical education.
Oh, physical education.
So gym teacher, yeah.
Gym teacher. Uh-huh. Well, there is some crossover and similarities between doing youth ministry and being a Phi Ed teacher.
Oh,
There really
yes.
are.
Yes, there are. Yes.
So you weren't moving that far away from the first goal when you came in and wanted to go in the direction of youth ministry. But that's really what I was looking at, was a young man who really wanted to find a place to serve.
Do you remember the organization and in at CUW that you kind of guilted me into being the president of?
Why, yes, I certainly remember that organization. It was, and I don't know if it still exists. Boy,
Yeah, I
next
don't
time
either.
I'm
I
on
actually was looking
campus
that up the other day.
talking with Kurt Taylor, the new director of the program, which, by the way, even the program name has changed to Director of Church
Mm-hmm.
Ministries rather than Director of Lay Ministry. Um, yeah, it was the UPCO, the Undergraduate Pre-Professional Church Work Organization. And because the pre-sem students had their organization and the pre-teachers, the teacher ed students, they had their organization, but there was nothing for everybody else, the lay
Mm-hmm.
ministers, the music directors. And so, yeah, we created that organization. And out of that organization came a couple of conferences that dealt with apologetics primarily. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I guilted you into, and I think
Yeah.
you described that process quite accurately. That's
Yes.
that's what happened.
Was I just an easy target?
Well, you were, yes, you were an easy target, but on the other hand, you were a student who was involved, and I could tell you'd probably do a good job, and that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, it definitely. I don't know if I necessarily did a good job. I remember delegating a lot of things, but that is something that like it helped me learn about like how to set a meeting agenda, and it just like running a meeting. I'd never done that really in a professional extent, and if I wouldn't have done that coming to peace, then it would have made my meetings even more awkward with the adults that I lead, older adults, I guess. I'm an
Yeah.
adult.
Well, you're just fresh out of college, and if you're probably working with parents or grandparents, for that matter, of the
Hmm.
students for whom you've got responsibility. So that it has a natural built-in awkwardness to it,
Right.
and not recognizing how you actually put together a meeting. That's another advantage for extracurricular activities on campus. Part of your education is what you pick up doing these other things.
Right. Do you remember what? So I had, like I said, many classes with you, and one of those classes was I had two classes in youth ministry, and in the second youth ministry class, there was like 7 or 8 of us, and we had to do a paper, and you handed me back a paper that had 99 out of 100 on it, and so I was flipping through the paper, and there were no comments really in the paper, and I asked you why I got a 99 out of 100. Do you remember what you said?
No, I don't. I'm sorry, but I
No,
don't
that's
recall.
okay. It is absolutely hilarious. So I asked, I was like, Dr. O, like, what's the deal? And he was like, oh, it's a great paper, very well done, but you're not Jesus, and just like carried on the conversation as if like just blew me out of the water. Everyone started laughing hysterically, and you just kept going. And I was just like, "Oh my gosh!" Oh yeah, like I was telling that story to Hannah, and she busted a gut the other night. Oh, that was good.
Huh, well,
Yeah, taking me to school on things like just how to give a subtle burn.
well, that's you know, uh, there were several students that I wound up spending time with in my office who have the difficulty of a more perfectionist personality, and it's difficult for some students, you know, not to get the 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's something that I struggle with myself. And it's the problem with that is that sometimes students do not know how to prioritize what they're doing, or accepting something that's less than perfect. And frankly, how often do any of us produce anything that's perfect? It's just very rare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, You think of a preacher who might wonder, oh, I could have done better on this message or that message. Well, yeah, you certainly could have. But this was the message that you preached, and this is how God's Holy Spirit used those words at that time. So live with it. Um, I mean, that's one of the things that we all have to work with, uh, and be kind to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's that issue of being able to prioritize. There's many things in life which we just need to get done, and done in an adequate way, not in a
A
superordinate way.
perfect way.
Right,
Yep.
not in a perfect way. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you, no, I don't remember that.
I was just ecstatic to get a 99.
I'm trying to
Oh.
remember. I think if that was one of those smaller classes, we were in probably Heidelberg 103 down in that basement.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm. Yep.
boy, there would have had to have been. I'm trying to think of some of the other students who would have been in that section.
Caleb Coonsey.
Oh yeah, there had to be a Kunze in
Um,
there.
yeah.
And
I
yeah.
maybe Mike Ramthen or shout
Mm-hmm.
out to those guys. Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
guys that were definitely willing to laugh at me.
Oh, that was a great group. That was
Hmm.
a fun class. I know, and you were also in Office of the Professional Church Worker. You were also
Hmm.
in Christian Caregiving. So there were
Hmm.
at least 4 classes that you would have had
Right.
with me.
And
So
that
yeah.
Office of Professional Church Worker is the next question in this little game. So
Oh,
another funny thing that you said to me was in Office of Professional Church Worker, I remember we took a lot of personality kind of tests. I don't know if personality test is the right word, but inventories and things like that. And I remember for when we did, I think it's the Myers Briggs. Is that the one where it's INFJ kind of stuff?
oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. So we took that one, and I remember like we were in class, we were kind of breaking down which letter you are and all that stuff. And I remember I was like 50-50 on all of them, just about. And you, do you remember the sassy comment you said to me then? Probably not, but
No, I don't, but I know what I would respond with as I'm thinking about it now, and have something to do with you're right smack dab in the middle of everything, and which means you're pretty adaptable.
well, that's very nice of you to say, but that's not what you said then. No, you simply like looked at me and you just said, "Blake, knock it off and get out." Very, very quick and sarcastically. Like you didn't actually mean it, but the class again just started laughing at me, and it was like, "Oh, what the heck?" Like I'm just trying to figure out what I am.
Well, another way to respond to that would be you're going to have to make up your mind.
Yeah.
I may be this, I may be that. Well, yeah, and
So I took Christian caregiving, and probably this kind of gets into the topic of today of mental health. I probably took that class where I was probably in the worst mental health position, I guess, in my college life. So just for the people listening, my mom got really sick and whatnot, and you must have heard about that in the prayers or something. And through like in class one day, I think you just kind of walked up before class and was like, "Hey Blake, like maybe we should go to my office after class if you're free and just talk through stuff." And I remember we met fairly regularly to talk about that, which was really awesome. And that helped you become probably one of the most influential, not just college professors, but pastors for me. You helped me go through a lot,
uh-huh.
actually talk through things. I don't remember how often it was, but I remember sitting in your office a lot and it was just kind of silent for maybe the first 5 minutes because I did not want to open up and didn't want to share things, what was bothering me, even though it was in the prayers that were said in chapel and sent in an email to everyone.
Hmm.
But how did you know that, or did you know that I needed someone to talk to? Because I had no idea.
I just looked at it as realizing that if your mother was going through these kinds of difficulties and you were so far away from home, that this was going to be something that'd be stressful for you. And I thought any student in that situation needs somebody to talk to, and so I just offered on that basis to spend some time.
Yeah, and it was awesome. I mean, it was really helpful. not right away, but as the year went on, because it wasn't just like a one time thing. At least I remember being in your office at least a couple, 5, 6 times.
Oh, yeah, I think we were probably meeting once
Yeah,
every 2 or 3 weeks for a period of time.
yeah, that's what I remember too. Very, very regularly, just to kind of talk through things and all of that. So I guess for the people listening, as we talk about mental health, what are some signs that they can like look for in others to kind of start that conversation? Because I think just talking about it and having someone to talk with about the things going on in our life can really help our mental health. So, what are some signs that we can look for in others to start that conversation?
Well, again, if you're thinking in terms of the people that you work with and your colleagues, if they seem distracted at times, if they seem overly fatigued or tired, just looking worn out, um, sometimes an inability to engage. Another warning sign that I've experienced myself is just a flattening of affect. Now, what do I mean by that? A flattening of affect is when an individual just doesn't seem capable of exhibiting any sense of joy or sorrow, for that matter. Just not being able to emotionally respond to a situation that's taking place. There's no energy there. There's no enthusiasm. There's no disdain. There's when that kind of thing begins to display itself, then I think it's time to see if that person could have someone to talk to.
I mean, you just came up to me and told me like, "Hey, we're like you're going to come to my office essentially." How would you recommend reaching out to someone?
Well, first of all, if a person's going through some difficulties, they're probably, at least my own estimation of it, they're probably going to have difficulty recognizing that they're going through this themselves. And so there's going to be a layer of denial that's going to take place, especially if we come across with, hey, it looks like you need some help. Why don't you come in? No, no, I'm okay. I don't need any help. So it needs to be done in some way that indicates, I'm your friend and let's have a conversation without any sense of judgment about it. Now, why do I say that? I Yeah, really, it's coming out of my own personal experience of having gone through clinical depression myself. This sense of flattening of affect was one of the signs that a colleague of mine used in order to intervene and assist me when my own power of denial was just kind of overwhelming me, and I was not able at that point to engage with it and recognize what was really happening. I needed somebody from the outside to come in and, in quite a public place, inform me that I needed some help. And perhaps, when I was hearing of what was happening in your life and then everything else that's going on for a college student with the pressures that you have for classes and a social life and all of those other things, that maybe you needed somebody to talk to.
Yeah, and I definitely did because at least in my experience, I had my friends were asking me about it, but I just would tell them, "Oh, it's fine. We're getting through it." Like you mentioned, kind of denying that there was really a problem, and yeah, I don't know. If you wouldn't have, if you, I sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you wouldn't have just said, "Hey, no, like you're gonna come to my office one way or another, and we're gonna talk about this." So that's good. So let's kind of reverse it now. So how would you recommend someone listening if they have some mental health troubles going on? How would you recommend that they get, I don't know, help, if that's the right word, but how would you recommend that they get assistance or help, or how they could start a conversation with someone? Because that might be a scary thing to do.
Yes, yes, it might. There's still a lot of, well, you might call it a stigma that there might be
Hmm.
in this.
Hmm.
Maybe it'd be helpful if I would simply share my own story that I referred to earlier and what I learned out of that, because that's probably one of the places that I drew upon when, deciding to ask you to come in for conversation. So this is what was happening. I had been called to the seminary in St. Louis, and I would spent 5 years as the director of resident field education, and I was also teaching the introductory course in pastoral theology, along with the one required education course at the seminary. A colleague of mine there took a call and left, and the seminary then asked me if I would be willing to take over the responsibilities that he had been doing. And that included, uh, he was the director of continuing education and the director of the Doctor of Ministry program. Now, it so happened that during these initial 5 years when I was the director of resident field education, that one of the things I needed to do to be able to stay there at the seminary was to get a terminal degree myself. I'd already had, besides the MDiv, I had a master's degree in educational psychology, guidance, and counseling from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee that I had gotten in 1976. So what I was doing was then doing a PhD program at the University of Missouri-Columbia, taking courses there while serving at the seminary. And that none of the courses were distance courses. They were all on campus at Columbia, Missouri, which is a 2-hour drive from St. Louis. So I was driving out there frequently. Anyway, so this was happening in the fall of 1995. And of course, I said, yes, I'll change positions and do that. So now I was the director of the Doctor of Ministry program and the director of continuing education. And I was teaching a course in adult ed that I had never taught before, besides doing the required education course that all the students were taking. In the meantime, that fall, I was scheduled to take 2 courses at the University of Missouri-Columbia, one on a Monday night, the other on a Wednesday afternoon. Those did not happen to conflict with my own teaching schedule, so I could manage that to some degree, except that meant that besides filling 2 new positions, I was also going to be on the road 8 hours a week, not counting the time that I would be spending in class. These were each 3-hour at a time classes at the university, and then the coursework that would go into those courses. Now, in the meantime, during the fall, I discovered that the secretary who knew how the Doctor of Ministry program operated was not going to be able to be working at the seminary any longer, and I was going to have a temporary individual working there. And at the same time, I discovered that the continuing education program that was scheduled for the fall at the seminary, which I had been told was pretty well in order, was not well planned at all. The publicity hadn't been done, the program hadn't been scheduled, and all of that was due to take place in about in the middle of October. So that didn't give us a lot of time from August to get publicity out, create a program, get speakers, and so forth for that program. So there was a lot of pressure taking place. So now, at the same time, the seminary, noting that I had been the field ed director for the last 5 or 6 years and knew the congregations and was very well aware of how that program worked, they asked me if I wouldn't mind being the acting director of resident field education, simply to get the placement taken care of and all of those matters. Well, of course, I said yes to that. Now, I should back up for just a moment right now and share what was going on in my own personality that was influential in how I was responding to these questions. One thing I've discovered is that I have a strong desire to please people. And because I want to please people, I really have a difficulty saying no when I'm asked to do something. At the same time, I actually have a streak of perfectionism myself. I desire to do things well. I don't know really how to not try and do everything I'm trying to do as well as possible. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I have difficulty with the concept of getting a C. Everything's got to be an A. And so I'm doing this graduate program where everything has to be an A, and I'm running now 3 different directorships where everything has to be an A. At the same time, things are falling behind because we didn't have the resources, the individual who knew what was going on in the DMIN program schedules were being missed, dates when we had to have information sent out to students, dates when faculty needed to be solicited and signed up to teach courses when the Doctor of Ministry students would be coming on campus. In the meantime, I was already scheduled to do a continuing education event for pastors in Oklahoma in August, and well, there were 12 people, 12 pastors signed up for that. I couldn't disappoint them by canceling, so of course I went out to Oklahoma in August in the midst of everything else. In September, there was a conference taking place in Chicago that I was signed up for called Dedicated Early Success for Children at Risk. Well, that was such an important thing. I certainly couldn't say no to that. Later on, the Missouri District Church Worker Conference was being held at Lake of the Ozarks, and they needed a presenter. And so, well, of course, I would say yes to doing that. And then I was also working on the Missouri District Continuing Education Committee. Let's see, what else was there going on? Oh, yes.
Could
Well,
there
of
be
course, the
anything else?
Lutheran High School Association was
Wow.
celebrating its 50th anniversary in St. Louis, and they needed a preacher for a special service. So, of course, I said, yeah, I'll do that. Then, in November, I got a call from Concordia University Chicago, which was River Forest at the time. They had a distance site in St. Louis for educators, and they had a basic educational research course that needed to be taught. Well, that was exactly what I was studying in my PhD program, and so they asked if I'd be willing to teach that for them in St. Louis, and that would be in January and February and March. And I said, well, sure, I'll do that. I'll put that together. In the meantime, the annual symposium of the seminary needed to be put together and planned. And of course, I needed to do that. And on free Saturday afternoons, my son Andrew was learning how to drive. He had his learner's permit, so I would be taking him out and teaching him how to drive at the Muni parking lot close to the seminary campus.
That's a lot of stuff. Holy moly. And then to try to do them well, yeah.
And then there was something else. There's an entity called the Biblical Charity Foundation, which was part of the continuing education office at the seminary. They have an annual meeting, and it's made up of pastors from California, or at least at this time. I don't know what's going on with this now, if it even exists anymore. But this Biblical Charity Foundation was part of the continuing education program. There were 3 pastors from California who were part of it, plus 3 professors and the director of continuing education from the seminary. It was because there was a donor who had given a substantial amount of money to the seminary for the study of biblical charity, another way of describing social ministry, but it would be social ministry done in a biblical fashion. They had an annual meeting that was planned, that needed to be planned, and this would take place in January and in Indianapolis. In preparation for that, I needed to prepare a booklet indicating what kinds of grants, because the interesting thing here is that the foundation would give grants to organizations in order to put into practice certain types of biblical charity. And then we would study this and learn from it. Very good idea at the roots of it. So there's this meeting that's going to take place in January in Indianapolis, and I'm responsible for making all the arrangements for it, getting the airline tickets for the 3 professors. And by the way, we're meeting in Indianapolis because the folks from California are flying into Indianapolis, and from there they're going to go to Fort Wayne Seminary for their annual symposium. Now, this booklet that needed to be put together would also have in it the kinds of forms that we would distribute. So I'm creating forms that congregations and other organizations can use in order to submit their requests. And of course, I had gone through during the fall a couple of training sessions on how you actually do this as a foundation. Now, how do you suppose I'm going to create that booklet? Is it going to be manageable, or is it going to be as well done as possible?
You're probably going to try to do it as well done as
Absolutely,
possible.
yeah, as well as
Yep.
everything else that's going on this fall. Okay, so what was happening to me in the meantime? I was, again, unable to say no, so I was saying yes to all of these things, and then wanting to do them perfectly. So this is burning the candle at both ends. about midway through the fall, I started having difficulty by waking up earlier and earlier in the morning. First, it was 5:30, then 5, then 4:30, and then around late November, I started to have difficulty getting to sleep. Now, I thought Christmas break was going to be coming and things would kind of reorient themselves and I'd catch up then. But no, even after that, I was having difficulty getting to sleep. First, it would be 11 o'clock, then 11:30, then 12. Eventually, those 2 points, waking up and getting to sleep, wound up meeting. And for about the 4 days prior to this trip to Indianapolis, with the Biblical Charity Foundation and this very wonderful book that I had produced for them, I was hardly sleeping at all. Now, during the fall, there were others who had noticed something was happening. I was also part of a committee working on creating a clinical pastoral education site at Laclede Groves Manor in St. Louis. And Pastor Joel Hempel, who is the pastor who is in charge of this clinical pastoral education or CPE site, one time after one of our meetings, he asked, "Are you all right?" And of course, my response was, "Yes, I'm fine. No, no, I haven't had any problems." Well, because that whole the irony of that is the whole program of CPE is designed in order to help pastors be more aware of their own needs so that they can better meet the needs of others.
Right.
There's an irony in there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming up to this meeting in Indianapolis, and I haven't been sleeping. And yet, we get on the plane, we land in Indianapolis. I'm responsible now for getting the rental car and driving us around Indianapolis. If you're familiar with that city, they've got this interstate that goes all the way around town. It's kind of like a big racetrack. And the meeting's on the opposite side of town. And while I'm driving with the 3 other professors who happen to be some of the smartest people I've ever encountered, I mean, this was the brain trust of our theology faculty, I actually felt like I was having a panic attack. I realized I was in no condition to be doing this, and with the people that I had in the car, well, they didn't notice anything because, again, my own ability apparently to deny and to hide was extraordinary. We went through the entire meeting. We flew back to St. Louis, and at that point I thought, now I'll be able to sleep because this is now over. But I didn't. I couldn't. And so it was another sleepless night. The next day, I taught my education courses in the morning, and then kind of just had lunch and vegetated in my office until the practical department meeting that took place at 4 o'clock in the boardroom. And as that meeting was winding down and the group was about ready to adjourn, one of the other faculty members happened to be the person who taught the Christian counseling courses. He said, "Before we adjourn, I think we need to do something for our brother John." And the chair of the meeting responded by saying, "Well, he seems to have had a lot on his plate recently. Maybe next fall we can lighten his load by a course." And my colleague responded, "No, I don't mean next fall. I mean right now. I don't want to get a phone call that John is up on the tower with a rifle."
Referencing
Yes,
University of
yeah.
Texas, right?
Uh-huh. And without thinking, I shot back at my colleague and said, "I don't own a rifle," which to this day just causes chills to run up and down my spine as I realize what I had said. Because I was saying, I won't hurt anybody else, but I wasn't saying I won't go up the tower. And that was truly frightening. The chairman of the meeting, he brought the meeting to a rather rapid close. He said, "John, you meet with Joe for a while," and which I did. Then after that, the fellow teaching the counseling course got me in touch with a licensed clinical social worker to serve as a therapist, who then I saw within a day or two. When she met with me, she realized that I was going to need medication in order to get out of this, because by this time I was clinically depressed. And so she got me in touch with a psychiatrist, who I then saw by the end of the week. And he put me on some antidepressants, and then I spent the next 5 weeks pretty much doing absolutely nothing, just sitting at home trying to
Wow.
trying to heal from what was going on. And the next quarter began, and I taught one course in the morning, hung out in my office until lunch, and then went home and just rested again because by that time I was fried. It took about 6 months before I was back to normal and taking courses at the university again and fulfilling other responsibilities. But so one of the things to take away from this, as I look back on it, is that intervention of my colleague took place in a very public setting where I could no longer deny that something was happening. And that was an important component part of that experience.
And it wasn't done to embarrass you. It was done to so that you couldn't back out and so that
Right,
you couldn't deny
right.
the help.
Because here was somebody who could see what was going on and knew that something had to be done. Now, what I wound up learning out of the therapy, and I met with the counselor for about 2 years and continued meeting with the psychiatrist for for 6 years until finally we moved up to Milwaukee. But what I was learning was that, first of all, I have an inability to say no, and I like to do things really well, and that's who I am, and I need to find tools by which I can manage that. That really became the thing that I needed to do.
What are some of those tools?
First of all, I developed, a set of checklists, actually. A values check and a roles check. It's a list of 10 different values that I have and things that are important to me to keep myself oriented. And I would go through this values check about once a week and simply rewrite everything. So, first value is faith, second value, family, third value, community, fourth value, vocation. And then I'd have a comment beside each of these, and I'd repeat those comments and write them out every week. And this was to reorient how I was looking at what I was doing and how I was talking about it to myself. Same thing then was with the roles check. What are my roles as husband, father, professor, and all of those things, and then what I was going to be doing during the coming week in order to make sure that things were going to be managed in a way that was possible. What are some of the other things that I recognized? Rest is really important, and that learning how to get a C is important. That's just to say, okay, this is something that needs to be done. It doesn't have to be done perfectly. All it needs is to be done enough
Right.
so that it gets done. I learned that this was actually a spiritual problem. I think this was one of the biggest insights that I learned from
Mm.
the sessions with the therapist, is that this was a spiritual problem. Um, I'm a good preacher of the gospel. I know how to divide law and gospel, and I could do that in preaching, but I wasn't good at it for myself. And I needed to remind myself that I need gospel. Otherwise, I'm driven by the law. I recognized also that this was something that I could not do alone. I needed help, and it was not a problem to get help. I also learned something else that was interesting, and that is by actually talking about this and sharing what happened with my own clinical depression did not limit my own ability to minister and serve. It actually enhanced it. I don't know if that makes sense
Mm-hmm.
to you as you're listening to it, Blake, but
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Yeah, I've learned that too, just in very different contexts. But like I've shared my story of meeting with you with my confirmation students when we've gone through certain Bible stories, like Elijah in the wilderness, where he doesn't see any other way out but to die, and just talking about like no, like you
yeah,
need to get help, and you can share what you're going through with people because like you just mentioned, it is okay to not be okay. It is okay to need help. We all need it.
exactly.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense
Well,
to
it
me.
opened my eyes to areas of service, and it is something that made me approachable. If I had all my defenses in place at all times, and I was this perfect individual who really didn't have any perceivable difficulties or problems himself, I mean, who would seek me out for assistance for anything? How could I
Mm-hmm.
even understand what others would be going through? But if I myself have had some problems in life and difficulties, well, then that becomes a different matter.
You become so much more relatable, as you mentioned. Like, just they can share their struggles with you because you're not above them. Like, you have
Yeah.
experienced
There's
it.
advantages to being human rather than
Mm-hmm.
superhuman. Another thing I realized is that I'm not indispensable. I mean, when suddenly I wasn't doing all these things, the seminary didn't collapse. uh, they
Right.
they could take care of themselves, and of course, actually, over time, I've had the opportunity to make presentations on this whole topic of mental health and well-being at pastors' conferences and at the Lutheran Education Association Triennial Convocation. I mean, I've done a lot of speaking on this subject with other folks, and that's because all of us are going to find ourselves either having these. God calls a lot of people who want to please others into ministry, and also people who want to do things well. And if those don't happen to be an individual's characteristics, chances are, if they're in ministry, they'll be working with people who do. And so these become things to watch for, that they don't overdo it, because that's so harmful.
Right. And I think, just in terms of mental health, talking about these things is so important in 2020 and moving forward, because it is something that is on the front burner. I think a lot of people's minds, being mentally healthy, taking care of yourself, sharing things with others is talked about, but then putting it into practice is really hard, but it's necessary.
Well, yeah, it's not like I didn't know these things from the time I
Right.
graduated from the seminary, but living them out,
Yeah.
no, that was a different matter. Another thing that I found really helpful was personal devotions, making sure that I had a lively personal devotional life, which really hadn't been the case beforehand. I had mixed the professional use of the Word of God with the personal use of the Word of God, and those are not the same thing. Another thing that I've done now is when I do get asked to do something, I tend to ask my wife, "Does this look like a good idea to you? What do you think?" And she's very honest with me about that.
Yeah, that's really good. Are there any other lessons that you have learned that you're willing to share?
The big surprise was that, I thought that this was going to wind up, to admit to these kinds of flaws that I saw in my own personality would wind up limiting my own ability to serve, and instead it just the opposite. I mean, I don't know how many times I sat in my office, the same one that you sat in, with other students who did not know how to get a C. And I would I would work with them, well, in order to reconcile for themselves this issue of not everything has to be perfect. One of my own daughters is afflicted with the same thing, and I remember that when she got a B on her report card, we took her out for dinner. Not when she got all the
Nice. Right.
A's.
Yep.
It's
Right. Now when she got the A,
when she got.
man, if my parents would have done that, that would have been awesome. I would have gone out for dinner a lot.
Well, well, recognize this was being rewarded for not getting the A. And then the final lesson is that this is who I am, and so I need strategies to realize and work with this, because those tendencies of wanting to please and being a perfectionist aren't really going to change a whole lot. But how I deal with it can change a whole lot, and it has made a huge difference.
Yeah, like we are who we are, and then we need to just kind of strategize our way around our own imperfect state at times. That was that was really good, Dr. O. Like, thank you so much for sharing. I think that that's huge. I mean, I do a lot of that in my youth group. I don't necessarily do that a lot with my friends, which maybe is where a lot of people listening, where we can kind of start, is with those closest to you, which might be harder than doing it in a room of people. I'm not
Well,
sure,
there's
but
risk involved. And then again, recognize that if you do kind of broach the subject with somebody that you're concerned about, don't be surprised if they brush it off. because again, our powers of denial are enormous. And so that doesn't mean that you don't try again sometime in the future.
So, like in your story and mine, where I see a parallel, I guess, is where I did not approach you for help, and you did not necessarily approach anyone else for help. So, how would you encourage someone to not be like us, and to encourage someone to ask for help? How would you recommend someone ask for help?
Well, I've often, you earlier said you didn't know what would have happened if I hadn't intervened. And I've often thought the same thing if my colleague hadn't intervened for me in a public setting like a theology practical department meeting. So I don't know exactly, what it would have taken. I think, for example, if we're having some physical problems, if it hurts bad enough, we'll finally go to the doctor. And I'm wondering if we don't have to look at ourselves and think, okay, how bad do I have to hurt before I'll ask for help? And actually ask ourselves that question, make a mark of that, and say, okay, that's too high. I don't have to hurt that much before I can get some help. The other thing is to realize that if we have difficulty saying no, that's something that we need to work on ourselves with the guidance and help of others, certainly. But sometimes when I made this presentation, people have asked, well, didn't the seminary have some responsibility to watch what was happening to you? And ultimately, of course, my colleague did. But as this was taking place throughout that entire fall, and I was, over functioning to such a large degree. And my answer is that, well, actually, the seminary is an institution, like all the institutions we might find ourselves working for, and it has needs. And if it can find ways to fulfill those needs and requirements that it has, it will continue to do so. It was my responsibility to finally say, no, I can't go any further. This is as far as I can go.
So kind of advocating for
Yes.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Being able to say, no, I can't do this. And it's not because I don't want to. It's because I physically should not and
Right.
cannot do
Right.
this.
If I'm to continue functioning, I just can't do this. And that becomes our own responsibility. And that comes with learning how to say no. And maybe being a little bit more comfortable with knowing, okay, that's going to disappoint somebody, but that's going to be their issue to work with, not mine.
It reminds me of, have you ever seen the movie Yes Man with Jim Carrey?
No, I haven't. Maybe I've lived that movie,
Okay, so
but I don't think I've seen it.
it's a comedy movie, but it just like Jim Carrey's character goes to a conference where he's told that you should say yes to everything. And it's like, yeah, no, that's probably not the greatest the greatest mentality to have. We need to be able to say no, I can't. It's not that you don't want to necessarily, but you can't. You need to set a boundary for yourself, whether you're in ministry or you're working in a company or something like that. You need to set a boundary. You need to say no to something. Yeah. So the last question is, what is one recommendation that you have? It doesn't need to be related to this topic. It certainly can be, but what is one recommendation that you have for the people listening?
Make sure that you use the gospel for yourself.
For those that are listening that maybe are not as attuned to that, how would you recommend doing that?
We're going to fall short because we're human, but that's why Jesus came, because we're the fallen humans. He was not, and his grace is sufficient for us, and we can trust that grace. So when we find ourselves not as adequate as we wish we were, that doesn't mean that we're somehow unfaithful or poor stewards. It simply means we're stewards of the one who's come to do it for us.
Amen. Yes. Thank you, Dr. O. And thank you so much for being on today. Thank you for sharing a very personal time in your life and in your ministry. I really do
You're
appreciate
very welcome.
it.
God's blessings to you, Blake, to you there, and to the congregation at Peace, and to your staff, and especially to the youth that you work with.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Dr. O.
Say hello to Hannah for me.
And thank you so much for sticking around with Dr. Oberdeck and I as we talked about a pretty heavy topic today. But hopefully you were also able to laugh along with the jokes. I again want to thank Dr. O for being so willing to share a a darker moment maybe in his life. If I encourage you as you're listening, if you are maybe struggling with mental health or you know someone, help them. Get help yourself. You don't need to go through this alone. None of us are in this alone. As always, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. You can follow me on Twitter at BlakeBrockman33. Until next time, for These Are My Thoughts, we'll see you soon.